welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, and welcome to another chapter of Turn the Page, the official podcast of Syosset Public Library. I'm Jenn, your co-host for today, and I'm here with the writer of a really fantastic, absolutely lovely new book. May I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Anthony Marra, and my new novel is Mercury Pictures Presents, which is a historical novel set in 1930s and 40s Los Angeles and Italy.
So I would love to talk about this book, but before we get there, I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about your career as a writer, what else you've written, and how it sort of led you to this project.
Yeah, I began with my first book was called A Constellation of Vital Phenomena, and it is set in during the Russian-Chechen conflict of the 90s and early 2000s. I gravitated to Eastern Europe as a young person and as a young writer, and so my first two books, both Constellation and the follow-up, The Tsar of Love and Techno, are set within the world of the former Soviet Union. And while Hollywood may seem like a rather large geopolitical jump from the world of the former USSR, I find that as a writer, I'm drawn to places where kind of anything can happen. I think that as a reader, I love that sense of experiencing a world where sort of the impossible occurs on a regular basis. And after writing two books set in the USSR and the post-Soviet world, I was about ready to come in from the cold, and I began thinking about Los Angeles and Hollywood specifically during the golden age, in part because I used to live in LA. My wife is from there, but in part because it's also this place where sort of the fantastic and reality converges on a regular basis, and it felt like a world in which I could actually continue down some of the sort of thematic paths that I had pursued in my first two Soviet set books.
That is so interesting, and I think that you're absolutely correct about LA, and it was an interesting period in time for the film industry, this moment of transition, sort of like because talkies were still fairly new. The production code was sort of ramping up and becoming like a real thing that movie makers had to deal with. But it's also a really fascinating moment in Italian history with the rise of fascism, and American history with immigration and like the approach of World War II. And, there's just so much rich historical detail there. And has also been a recurring theme in your work. And I'm wondering what your research process looks like. Like, what kind of materials do you look at? Like, how do you bring a past era to life so vividly?
Yeah, it honestly begins in the library. I'm not just saying that because I'm on your on your podcast. Yeah, so I love the fact that history is a far more inventive creator than I am. And one of the pleasures of writing sort of historical fiction is that you get to raid the cupboards of the past for interesting anecdotes and stories. So this book is set largely within the world of this B-movie studio called Mercury Pictures. And this is a period in which tens of thousands of emigres and exiles fleeing war in Europe arrive in Los Angeles, and many of them ended up finding employment in the margins of Hollywood in some of these B-movie studios. Frank Lloyd Wright once said that if you tip the world on its side, all of the loose pieces will land in LA. And this this book is largely concerned with those loose pieces. And I wanted to sort of take a look at this milieu through the perspective of a character named Maria Lagana, who is this tough, ambitious, irreverent striver. I sort of imagined her as Rosalind Russell's character in His Girl Friday, only a bit more salty and a lot more Italian. And when we first meet her, she sort of nothing in her life is going right. Her boss is under investigation by isolationists in the Senate, and his toupee is shrinking, and her family life has sort of gone to hell. And like many characters in this book, she finds her way to Mercury while outrunning her past. She grew up in fascist Italy and left for Los Angeles with her mother after a childhood transgression resulted in her father's arrest and imprisonment. So she has reinvented herself as this unflappable producer, even as she's been haunted by the role she played in her father's fate. All of which is to say that there was kind of a lot of different moving parts in terms of how I approached research. It wasn't only the world of Hollywood, but also the world of Italy and of Europe. And one of the things that I sort of always kept in mind as I researched was thinking of how the process of research, how that sort of process of discovery was less about finding colorful details to lend an air of accuracy and more about figuring out the structure of the book itself. I think many writers talk about research using the language of archaeology. They're unearthing this or they're discovering that. I always imagined it more as the process of making a map. Where you're trying to figure out physically the dimensions of the world of the book, and every interesting factoid, every anecdote, everything that I felt like brought that era to life became a little pin that I was putting on my map. And so the process of writing the book became trying to figure out how I was going to move from coordinate to coordinate, from interesting node of research to interesting node of research, and that ended up sort of building out the spine of the book itself. And in terms of like what those little moments that spoke to me as a writer, that I realized I had to figure out how to fit them in the novel. It was most often those moments of the incredible and the seemingly impossible. So one example would be I came upon this brief history of the aviation industry during World War II in Los Angeles. And one sort of fascinating aspect of it was that Lockheed Martin and Douglas Aircraft, these big aviation plants, hired Hollywood set designers to build false suburbs on the roofs of their aviation facilities in order to fool any potential enemy bombers from targeting these big aviation plants. And so you had these fake neighborhoods that had been constructed on the roofs of these airplane hangars. And it's little moments like that where the fantastical sort of asserts itself in the realm of history that I tried to really look for and exploit.
I love that. And I think it's really interesting to me how sometimes history comes most alive when it like bucks your expectations or resists reality rather than conforms to it, because like that little detail is something that like when I encountered that, I was like, I've never heard this before. It's so interesting. And it felt so real, even though it's like slightly, just surreal, like it's really interesting the way that like oftentimes life itself and history feel most real when they are slightly dreamlike or surreal. That's a very interesting.
That's so beautifully put, and I couldn't agree more. And it's interesting, like my my sort of philosophy as a writer is, in terms of writing about the past, is that those moments of the surreal and the fantastical, those have to be based in reality, and it's the more everyday, ordinary moments where I feel the license to invent. But yeah, like all of the big sort of surreal moments in the book are all rooted in fact.
Mm. And, I think it speaks to like, we often talk about world building when we're talking about like science fiction or fantasy, but historical fiction takes just as much world building, because you are bringing a world that doesn't really exist to life, doesn't really exist anymore, rather, and that it resembles ours, but it's still very different and would feel foreign to us were we to, be placed there. And so I'm wondering, like, how do you sort of walk this line between portraying the very grounded and the real and the historical, and then also working in these more these elements that might challenge your sense of reality,
Yeah, it's really interesting. I find that I do tend to learn a lot from other. I mean, I find that the sort of classifications of different genres are somewhat arbitrary and often feel a bit silly to me. I feel like a good book, a good story is a good story. But I do find that I learned so much from reading outside of my wheelhouse, and I think that science fiction and fantasy does do such an incredible job of world building and of thinking through sort of all of the ramifications within a particular novel of certain geographical or social or historical trends or features, and I think that you're absolutely right that when thinking about historical fiction, you are sort of building a world that in some ways is as unreachable as Narnia.
Mm-hmm.
It's vanished, it's gone, and all we have are the memories of those who are who still who live through it, and the books and histories and memoirs. So I think that in terms of balancing of walking that line, I think it's important to consider like what the ultimate aim of historical fiction is. I think that that for me is historical fiction describes the period in which it's written more than the period in which it's set.
Mm-hmm.
That if it's never really made sense to me why we would look at a book written today if we want to understand the way that the world was 80 years ago. You can just pick up a book that was written 80 years ago, and that'll give you a much better sense. I think we pick up historical fiction today because it creates a space where we can look at different themes, different ideas that we're struggling with, different conflicts today, and see them in a different context. Can see how certain divisions or pathologies play themselves out across the arc of human affairs and American history. So many of the things that these characters, many of the conflicts these characters are facing in this novel are, in one way or another, conflicts that we are, we're facing today, whether it's the rise of misinformation and propaganda, the specter of, these images of Europeans fleeing war on the continent, the rise of banning and censorship of books and other art forms, the demonization of immigrants and refugees, these like very stark partisan divides, all of these things that these characters are dealing with in the early 1940s are things that in one way or another we're dealing with today. And I think that like one of the real powers and the real importance of historical fiction is that it gives us the opportunity to see how people have experienced and how they manage these conflicts in the past, and to see how we might do better.
Mm. Yeah, that is so interesting. And it did occur to me as I was, coming to work this morning, that for listeners at home, we were meant to do this interview last week and it got pushed back a week. And it occurred to me this morning that it's even more relevant this week than it would have been last week with, Italy just electing its first fascist since Mussolini. And, like we're in this very odd historical moment where a work of historical fiction like this can speak very urgently to the present in ways that were perhaps not even like quite foreseeable when it was being written or when it was being prepped for publishing. And have you found yourself being surprised at all by its reception or by its resonances with the current day?
Yeah, it's never good when a novel set in the 1940s feels topical, is it?
No.
Yeah, no, it's certainly certainly dispiriting. When a book set in so my first my first novel is about the Russian invasion of Chechnya, and obviously that has felt tragically timely over the last year as well. I think that that if you kind of wait long enough, any work of historical fiction becomes newsworthy again. That sadly, I think we tend to return to the same history moves in perhaps circles rather than straight lines, and unfortunately, yeah, I mean the election of Maloney in Italy, I think, is absolutely it doesn't bode well to have an actual pseudo fascist in government there once again. One of the sort of interesting things about Italian politics is how often it's been sort of the almost like the laboratory from which ideas escape into the wider global political sphere. Whether it was Mussolini, in the 20s, and obviously a decade later. You had Hitler and Franco and all of that, or Berlusconi in the 90s, sort of, who in many ways like really prefigured Trump. I think it's anytime things go south in Italy, you look a couple years down the line, and it doesn't bode well for the rest of us.
Yeah, absolutely. My gosh, that's such a good and disturbing point. I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about Artie and Maria, because they're both fantastic characters and they have a great relationship. They have a really great, like, lived in sort of familiarity. And I'm so glad that you brought up His Girl Friday before, because I saw so much of that kind of like snappy, witty repartee like in their scenes together. And I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about, you know, why you think they fit so well together, why they work so well together, and what their commonalities and maybe their differences are. Because like their relationship really is in a lot of ways like, well, there's a lot of relationships at the heart of this book, but it's one of like the anchor relationships, that's sort of like, could you talk a little bit about them?
Yeah, absolutely. So Artie is Maria's boss, and he is this kind of wonderfully ebullient showman. He started Mercury Pictures with his brother, whom he's been feuding with sort of ever since they were born, and he is he is heavily toupeed and sort of wears, very bold shirts and ties, and is kind of this essentially this street fighter in a a C-suite of a movie studio. And I kind of loved just as you said, the back and forth that he and Maria develop over the course of the book. I've always been drawn to screwball comedies and just sort of the rat-a-tat dialogue. And this was sort of the first book that I've worked on where the setting encouraged that kind of attempt to really lean into one of my personal favorite genres. And I felt that in His Girl Friday, in a lot of those movies, they're one of the few spaces in sort of like golden age cinema where women are presented as very strong and very highly witty and can really go toe to toe with the male characters in those scenes. And I felt that just like was a genre and a setup that really spoke to Maria as a character who is this kind of wonderfully she's just like a striver, a go-getter. And she and Artie have this sort of very close sort of working friendship. And Artie is kind of the only person at this studio that really encourages and recognizes how talented and how good a potential movie producer Maria is. And in turn, Maria sort of recognizes that beneath all of Artie's bluster, he is actually this very decent person within the limitations of his of his within his sort of rather severe moral limitations, let's say. And yeah, and so the book is sort of based around their working relationship and how they, they're both these outsiders. And I kind of just love the way that they're able to recognize each other's outsiderness and sort of form this kind of like makeshift work family.
Yeah, and it occurred to me while I was reading that obviously it's so much fun to read like snappy screwball comedy dialogue. It's like a great entertainment choice and a great storytelling choice, but it's also a very interesting character choice too, because I was wondering as I was reading is that I wonder if something that perhaps they see in each other is that like we all have that like witty, funny friend who like presents a very carefree, very confident, very strong front, but oftentimes that is like a defense mechanism or some sort of like performance in order to cover like a real vulnerability or a real sort of uncertainty. And I kind of wondered if that was something too that they saw in each other.
Yeah, that's so well put. Yeah, I absolutely think that they both they both have these rather traumatic pasts and are sort of have come to Los Angeles and to this studio to in some ways try to reinvent themselves and to create a kind of life that is more stable and more prosperous and more secure than what they had known previously. And I think you're absolutely right that humor becomes for them and for many characters in the novel becomes a way of both disguising one's pain and also maybe kind of making sense of it. That I think that humor is a way that is sort of how we articulate absurdity. And I think many of these characters, and certainly Maria and Artie, find themselves in a lot of absurd situations.
They absolutely do. The one last thing I wanted to, well, no, I have two things. Sorry. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Eddie, Maria's boyfriend, because I really enjoyed him as a character too. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about him and whether he draws on any real figures you encountered, or perhaps like a composite of figures, because there were people like him in Hollywood who couldn't find work because of their ethnicities or their background. So could you talk a little bit about where he came from too?
Yeah, absolutely. So Eddie Liu is Maria's significant other, and he is this brilliant Chinese American actor who, because of the racist typecasting in this period, and that extends to the present day in many ways, he is essentially only able to secure very demeaning roles. And he finds himself at the outbreak of World War II in this position where all of a sudden there is Hollywood needs has many roles that need to be filled for Japanese villains, and Eddie finds himself in the position of being cast as a Japanese villain, and he sort of deplores these roles that he's being given, but at the same time he is also determined to extract something from this industry that has for so long marginalized him, and this sort of tension between one's career and one's conscience is something that Eddie kind of struggles with over the course of the novel. And his family has been has lived in Los Angeles for 3 generations, but because of the prejudices and biases of the time, he is every bit as much of an outsider at Mercury as, if not more so, than the European exiles whom he works with. And he is sort of a composite of a number of actors who essentially experienced a similar moral sort of devil's bargain during this period. There's a reference in the book to Philip Ahn, who was a Korean American actor who also sort of was cast in a number of these Japanese villain roles. There were actors like Chester Gahn, who sort of experienced similarly difficult choices in terms of whether to take these roles and finally get a paycheck that they had long deserved, or to relinquish this sort of brief opportunity to leverage what little power they had in an industry that had long exploited them. And so Eddie and Maria, that was for me, that might be the heart of the book. I think that the ways sort of throughout the novel, both Eddie and Maria make choices that they know at some level they will later regret, and they sort of recognize this quality in one another. And I think what I find so beautiful and moving about their relationship is the fact that it's in some ways based on an acceptance of each other's fallibility. And I think that there's just something that I find really touching and really human about the capacity to see somebody you love as this this fallible person.
Mm. Yeah, that is really lovely. And they do have a very touching relationship, I think. And, you know, them taken together with Artie and a whole bunch of characters that we didn't even get to talk about, I think really show, all the different ways that you could be marginalized in your everyday life or in your professional career or in the country in which you live, and all of the different ways in which people respond to that and try to work within it or around it. And everybody makes different kinds of choices, and sometimes those choices work together and sometimes they don't so well. Those are really complicated, like a real acknowledgement just of how messy human relationships and are.
Yeah. I mean that was certainly what I hope that the book was doing. Yeah, I think that that it's I think that it's so often easy to sort of see the world, and particularly to see the past, as a series of rights and wrongs. And one of the things that I was hoping to do in the novel is to demonstrate how for people who historically didn't have very much power in the country at large, and in this industry in particular, it is a bit more messy than just right and wrong, yes and no. That to actually make those choices involves a great deal of just murkiness, and these characters are sort of living in this gray area where they're not quite certain if they are doing the right thing or not, and they might have the inkling that they're doing the wrong thing, but there's all of these other reasons that they can justify things to themselves. I think that in some ways the book is interested in just the way we rationalize our choices, and how a series of very small decisions, each of which might seem like an okay decision at the time, can kind of lead you to a disastrous place.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that something, I've absolutely fallen prey to this myself, but I think that oftentimes when we look back at history, we are looking back with 2020 vision and all this retroactive knowledge. And it's very tempting for us to be like, well, if I were in that situation, I would have done XYZ, with perfect rationality and no, no biases and no anything. And I think that books like this and things that really kind of consider people as whole beings, embracing their lighter elements and their darker elements, as it were, makes for more interesting storytelling, but also a more interesting and nuanced portrait of humanity, because whenever we encounter any other person or any other situation, we're bringing our whole selves, we're not always just bringing our best selves. And yeah, I want to thank you so much for coming to talk to us. This has been absolutely wonderful. And I'm wondering if you could talk at all about what you're working on now. Is there anything that's in the works that you're able to speak to, or?
So they always tell you that you should start a new book before your last one comes out, and I'm beginning to see why they say that. I've got a couple of possible ideas in the back of my mind, but nothing really to speak of yet.
Oh, okay. Well, I hope that, when you do, you'll consider coming back to talk to us, because I've really enjoyed this, and I love this book, and you're welcome back to the show anytime.
Oh, I would absolutely love that. Thank you so much for chatting with me. This is such a treat.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Okay, listeners, Mercury Picture Presents is available at a bookstore or library near you, and I highly suggest you pick it up. It is an absolutely beautiful book that just gave me so much to think about, that it still is living in my mind in a very real way. This has been Jen, and it is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.